Torrey Byles, our speaker today, is the principal economist of Granada Research, an economic and marketing consultant firm in Morro Bay, California. He has been a development economist for the Oregon State Small Business Development Center, an activist citizen, an economist for local regional development, an economist of supply chain management and electronic commerce systems, and a business and technology journalist in East Asia. Torrey has a master's degree in economics and environmental studies and is coming out in 2025 with a new book entitled The Nature of Money and the Rule of Nature. Welcome, Torrey.
Thank you, Alla. And I've got to say, my bio sounds so much better spoken with a Russian accent.
Russian Ukrainian. Okay.
So I'm
Yeah,
going to share my screen and we'll get underway here. So hopefully everybody can see that.
perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, so as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about communitarianism, which hopefully will become more meaningful when I get underway here. And basically, the talk will be a focus on two political philosophies, republicanism and liberalism, side by side, and how the invention of modern money, which took place in Italy in the Renaissance period, say about 1200 to 1500, has affected these two political philosophies. So in order to kind of bring a contrast, I'm sort of lumping a lot of things together. So I'm saying republicanism includes socialism, and liberalism includes utilitarianism, laissez-faire, and neoliberal economics. And I'll make clear here in the next slide, but I'll say so right now, that I'm using the classic definitions of liberalism and republicanism, for that matter, not how they've become inverted today, particularly in the USA, where the two names of the parties mean the exact opposite. A liberal today is actually a genuine Republican, whereas an American Republican today is supportive of a liberalist free market kind of philosophy. So I'm going to, in this talk, refer to the traditional meanings and the classic meanings of these terms, not what the American political parties hold them to mean. So the basic difference between Republican and liberal in the classic definitions is sort of a negative connotation. So the Republican version is the absence of being dependent on somebody else's will. And the liberal definition is simply the absence of any kind of interference whatsoever, but particularly the government. The Republican definition is a legal status given by the state. You're not a slave; you're a free person by law. Whereas the liberal believes that any form of law is a restriction of freedom, and actually, law is anti-freedom. The third thing about republicanism is the idea is every free person, every non-slave, has to participate in the process of legislating laws, either directly through assemblies or being involved in the legislature, or through representatives, elected officials, to legislate law. So everybody is a legislator. Every citizen is a legislator. So these are the fundamental differences between republicanism and liberalism. So, of course, it all started back with the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. Plato came up with the name republic, which means the public thing, res publico. And Aristotle really delved into the question of what is it like to live in a community of relationships with people in a republican that are dealing with the public good, a republican community. And so his treatise on politics and political theory is entitled Politico, politics. Politics means constitution. What's the constitution of this community in terms of the moral, ethical relationships where everybody's involved in self-governance? Uh, Aristotle made the sort of anthropological observation that humans live in groups. The human being is a political animal. It's a community animal. So that's the nature of what he's talking about when he's talking about politics. Is you're just expressing your own human nature because we live in groups. Now, a little bit after Plato and Aristotle, there was another Greek named Polybius who lived around 159 BC there, BCE. And he developed, on top of what Aristotle spoke about, is sort of a cycle of governments that goes from monarchy or aristocracy to democracy and then back again. And that they come and go and they collapse into anarchy and tyranny and mob rule. Aristotle had started with the recognition, I should say, of there's always going to be in a state or a community, there's going to be a leader, the one. There's going to be an oligarchy or an aristocracy. There's going to be a wealthy class of householders, and then there's going to be the mass of citizens, the people. And the idea of republicanism is that all three groups, the one, the few, and the many, have some participation in government for the maximum experience of democracy. So even starting with Aristotle, there's a recognition, there's an oligarchy, and there's either a monarchy or there's a tyrant, an elected president or an authoritarian, tyrant. And the difference, as we will see, I think, when we're comparing liberalism with republicanism, is that the absence of democracy is when things collapse back to being just a single leader with a handful of oligarchs running things. So that's what the Republicans are trying to ward off against. They want to have full participation by the many, not just the one and the few. So then, after the Greeks, of course, the Romans expanded, and Rome was initially started as a republic, right around the area of Rome. And these are some of the people that were involved, particularly in developing the legal idea of republicanism, where one's legal status is made free by law. And Seneca, Cicero, these are some of the key thinkers in that time period. And then, of course, Julius Caesar brought it all to an end when he declared himself to be dictator for life, and the Roman Empire from then on was no longer a republic. Now, let's see here. There, according to recent philosopher, a historian of political philosophy, an Englishman in Cambridge University, John Pocock, he holds that there were three distinctive moments in European history where the development of Republican theory really got off the ground. And I'm sorry, I wanted to get my timer going here. Three moments in history. And the first moment was the Italian Renaissance. And it was at this time that, due to the huge wealth creation, which I'll talk about when we get more into the money discussion later in this talk, the northern Italian republics in the Italian Renaissance period had become flourishing democratic republics where the one, the few, and the many were all participating in running public policy issues. And it was at the height of the Renaissance when this fell into a crisis, particularly when some of these people, as you see on the screen, the Medici family, the banking family, one of the wealthy trading slash banking, powers in Florence, um, took over the government and became kind of they corrupted the Republican form of government by buying off officials and putting in buying elected officials and bribing them to doing things their way. And so some of these other thinkers here, including Machiavelli, but not only Machiavelli, were administrators at those times and were writing about the appropriate form of republican constitutions and law. And so this was a big groundswell of theorizing, and it was really kind of because it was in a crisis mode, it was sort of a desperate time as well. The Medici had taken over. Then there were the larger military monarchies of France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire that were starting to come down and invade the northern area of Italy, as well as the complete peninsula of Italy. And this also prompted more speculation and theorizing about what's the appropriate form of republican government. So this was the first moment in history where republican theory started getting more definition, particularly for modern times. But this is going to be the critical moment also where money gets in, modern money, paper money, Italian banking style money gets inserted into the picture. And I'll talk about that in the second half. But I just want to go to the next moment in history where republican theory got further defined. And this was in England during the 1600s, when the Parliament of England, which was primarily an aristocratic, landholding aristocracy that had been in existence for since 1200 or so, and now this was about 1650. They abolished the monarchy and created a republic by cutting the head off of Charles I in 1649. And for 10 years they had a republic. Then there was a restoration of Charles II, I guess it was, and there was a monarchy back again. But then that monarchy was replaced again. The Parliament came back and restored a republican or a constitutional monarchy, but in 1688, and that's when the Parliament was overlording, well, more powerful than the monarch, and could take over fiscal issues about spending money from the king. And the monarchy was put into sort of a secondary position, and from then on. And some of the thinkers here are the Republican side of things. I include Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who are not exactly pure Republican, and Locke in particular leans towards the liberal side of things as well. But I'm just putting him in here. Harrington, Cromwell, and particularly John Milton and James Harrington were the real theorists of the Republican style, and they were essentially copying the ideas from the Italian humanists of the previous century that I showed in the earlier slide. So that's the English moment. And by the way, when the Parliament came back, they added the House of Commons, which was truly a representative form of government, not just the House of Lords, which was the aristocracy part of the Parliament. Now they had a House of Commons where there were elected officials from the boroughs and the countryside representing their issues around the public good in London, in the capital of the country. And what else was I going to say about that? Oh, well, of course, what that represented was an increase in the franchise, the voting power, the many of the now English and soon to be United Kingdom, with Scotland's Parliament joins with the English Parliament in 1701 or something like that. You had a widespread franchise. Well, not widespread. It was limited to men with property, no women, and it was still limited, but it would start expanding from then on. So the vote, having the vote, is an important part of the Republican ideology. Then the third moment of Republicanism that really brought forth a lot of discussion and theorizing and new practical implementation was, of course, the American rebellion of the 13 colonies against the British monarchy. And these are some of the thinkers here, including on to the present day. Madison, Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, who of course was a Democrat, and who today many free market theorists consider to be not a Republican. He truly was a Republican, because part of the Republican theory was to create a level playing field, an infrastructure, public services like education and defense. And so I'm including here him as a Republican thinker, even though he was, nominally a Democratic a member of the Democratic Party. And then there's Eisenhower, of course. So I just want to make it clear that, I want to also mention this, that okay, those three moments, the Italian experience, the British experience, the American experience, really was a sort of big historical moments where Republican theory got more formalized and more realistic than the earlier Roman and Greek period. But of course, it wasn't just the Anglophone or experience, or the Italian and Anglophone experience, but a lot of theorists starting in the 18th century, shown here: Montesquieu, Kant, Hegel, Marx, including modern day philosophers, Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, Hannah Arendt, Heather Cox Richardson, Michael Sandel. These are some of the modern day theorists of Republican theory, and still, active and developing the theory. Now, so that was the Republican historical view. Liberalism really was an invention, started in the 18th century, but really came into play in the 19th century, and particularly as the Industrial Revolution started getting underway. And here are some of the people here that are prevalent in that stream of thinking. It's really kind of starts with the French, with Francois Quesnay, who was one of the leading physiocrats in France. Physiocrat means, physiocracy means the rule of nature. Physics being the Greek word for nature. Natura is actually the Latin word for nature. So physiocracy is the rule of nature using Greek roots. But then we had the philosophy of David Hume. Obviously, Adam Smith was a free market kind of person, even though he had written another tract, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that got into Stoic philosophy and that kind of thing, which is somewhat more Republican in flavor. Jeremy Bentham with the Utilitarian, John Stuart Mill, and then you jump into the 20th century economists, Mises, Hayek. I put Keynes here. He's sort of a qualified liberal. He believed in markets for sure, but he also was the person who showed the new kind of, you'd call it a social ontology of the different kinds of constraints, fiscal and financial constraints for the different principal kinds of actors in an economy: government agents, private sector agents, corporations, banks, households, individuals. They all have different set of constraints. For example, the government, it does not have to have a balanced budget for things to continue to grow and expand. So I do use Keynes in this category of liberal because he is supportive of market activity to deal with distribution and allocation of resources, but he also provides, you would say, a Republican version of the basic ways of managing an economy, particularly in a downturn, and particularly for having guardrails and safety nets for all the people in it. So he's kind of a mixed thing. Then there's John Rawls, who also is a modern day sort of liberal political philosopher. Now, so I do want to just say that like I mentioned before, particularly in the American political scene, and starting in after World War II, these terms, liberal and Republican, got completely reversed. But it's important to note that at the end of World War II, there was what became called a liberal consensus. And so this was the mixture of, say, Keynes and Eisenhower, because Eisenhower, who was a Republican after World War II, built the interstate system of freeways. It was very strong on infrastructure development. And so both parties at the end of World War II in the United States, both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, had this general liberal consensus, and that's sort of the beginning of the confusion of things. But at that time, there was the beginning of the conservative moment movement in American politics. I'm getting focused on American politics. That's what I know the most about. But there was similar conservative movements in Europe as well. But in America, we had these kinds of actors who were and economists and politicians who were creating this conservative free market view of political theory and architecture for governments, which highlighted sort of the paring down of government intervention in markets. And so you have Joseph McCarthy, the anti-communist crusader, his attorney, Roy Cohn, William Buckley. Here you have Alan Greenspan being appointed central banker in the 80s. You have the Ronald Reagan era. Milton Friedman, of course, is, everything can be solved by the market. And present day Supreme Court Chief John Roberts with Donald Trump. Now, that's the kind of the history of republicanism versus liberalism. And now I want to turn to and see what happens when we look at how modern money has all along created and affected this evolving discourse on these two sort of poles of political philosophy, the Republican and the liberal. Modern Italian money, of course, is this bank-created money. And as Joseph Schumpeter points out, the two main features of that is the negotiable credit and created deposits. And what basically, paper money is, and what we have today is we don't need to carry around physical metal money. We use paper, checks, or in the case of credit cards, of course, it's not paper, it's plastic. Even on the web, we do transactions completely, there's no material involved. So when I say paper money, it just means non-tangible money. Prior to the Italian money, it was always, metallic money. But the ideal or the convenience of paper money is that you don't have to lug around all this heavy coinage, and the paper itself, whether it's a check or whether it's a state-sanctioned bill, like a currency unit, whether it's a lira, a florin, or a ducat, or a ruble, or a dollar, or a pound, Canadian dollar. It's a state-sanctioned bill of paper that you don't. Basically, what it is it can be used over and over again. That's what negotiable credit means. So you could take those bills and go back to the bank and get your gold or your metal coinage if you wanted to, but you don't. When you buy something, the seller receives that paper, and that seller can now go forward and reuse the same piece of paper. So that's one aspect of it. The created deposits aspect is banks started lending to their customers including states, governments, as well as at the time, of course, and they still do, but to the Roman Church, and for loans that didn't have any basically backing at the bank, didn't have any gold bullion or gold coins at the bank, but they issued paper money instead. They still issued paper money, so that was the created deposit side of it. Now, along with this kind of money, there was financial markets that grew up sort of around and among the banks, because they would, in trying to balance their books, they would sell off if they were getting into a crunch themselves. They'd sell off some of their liabilities to other banks, or there were money changers, just independent money changers and market traders who would buy and sell financial paper, promissory notes, letters of credit, bills of exchange, and so forth. They would trade these things, in these secondary markets. So that was a critical part of this new kind of money. And the correspondent banking aspect is to create this kind of money. You'd set up one company, one bank would have offices in multiple currency zones. The way the Italian republics became so wealthy was they were trading with the Eastern regions, from Mesopotamia and Persia, India, and so forth, that had their own currencies, but they were, bringing those goods back to the Western European monarchies and principalities and fiefdoms and so forth. That was just a mosaic of all these different local currencies. And so what they did was they would set up banking offices in all these different local currency zones, and they would handle all the financial foreign exchange issues without on a single ledger. Again, sort of facilitating economic activity this way. Also, public debt, like I say, some of the states started borrowing money, and there was bond issues and so forth that to pay for public goods development. And so then now a state or a republic had to be paying these banks, these private banks, they're paying them interest that came out of usually taxes and so forth. And then one of the key points, though, is this idea of leverage. This kind of money, because in part you could loan money that didn't exist, basically, the created deposits aspect. There was a tremendous freeing up of things that could be done compared to the old way of all these small little, principality confined mints of different metallic monies just to take care of small little things in the countryside, small little transactions, I should say, in the countryside. Now you had this proliferation. People in the cities, people across, countries could start doing transactions and trading, and furthermore, you could start producing new things, because part of trading was, the first step was to produce some kind of surplus that you would normally produce just for your local population. You'd produce an extra amount of built products, and then you'd trade them off to some foreign land for money. And so you would do those productive activities in addition to trading activities. So that the idea was that production expanded with this new kind of money much easier than before. So there was this, I'm calling it leverage, which was, of course, a physical concept back in the day of Archimedes, who, was the guy, the Greek philosopher, who said, "Give me a lever big enough, and I can move the whole world." Well, give me this Italian money, and I can move all this activity into action. So there's a tremendous amount of leverage with this kind of money. Now, the one little trick here is that we have kind of this asymmetry, I'm calling it, with money. The thing about money is it's always a social relationship. It's always between people. It doesn't have to do with physical things per se. In other words, we don't pay nature for the things that we extract from it or harvest from it. we pay people to go and do the extraction, do the harvesting, do the transformation of these raw materials into finished products, and then delivering it to us. So it's always a person-to-person, interpersonal, relational phenomena. The use of money. And one thing that happened during the Renaissance and before the Renaissance, the late medieval period, was there was this eruption in legal cases of what was called usury. And usury, we tend to think today as a term that just means loan sharking, charging high interest for loan, borrowing money. But usury back then, it meant a much broader realm of things that people did back when they were using money with each other. So, for example, taking interest on a loan was considered usury, but raising prices by a monopolist, that was considered usury. Beating down prices and a bargain by a keen bargainer, subletting of land by a tenant to other subtenants at a rent higher than he was paying, cutting wages, breaking the promise to your trade guild and going off on your own, that was considered usury. Insistence on an unreasonably good security for a loan, excessive profits, by a middleman. All these things were usury. So in modern terminology, it really was about extortion. And that's kind of what the social relationship of money kind of led to, was this wide surge in cases of legal cases during the late medieval period as more and more Italian money was being used in Europe. And it was overburdening, among other things, this strange legal arrangement or strange kind of structure of court systems. You had church courts, ecclesiastical courts, and you had king's courts. And it was more and more confusing, and there was a lot of overlapping jurisdictions about where to settle a lot of these money-related disputes. Now, and I just wanted to point out too here that this idea about the asymmetry of money was noted by Aristotle back in his day, when he said, the very same measure proves to be smaller when you're a buyer than when you're a seller. When you're a buyer, you want to value the good or service at a smaller measure. The value of it, you want to say, is smaller, because you want to keep the money, as much money as you can in your possession. Whereas the seller wants to have the higher value on the item. So there's this sort of intrinsic asymmetry when people start using money to do things. And this started coming out in the form of usury, aka extortion, in the late medieval period. This was documented a lot by R.H. Tawney in his great book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. So what this asymmetry led to was inflation, basically. And what I want to hold or claim in this talk is that inflation occurs during very liberal political regimes, where stable cost of living occurs during Republican political regimes. And when we look at the history of inflation over the last 700 years, we see that in these periods, the late medieval period, as more and more money started being used throughout Western Europe, there was a big bump in inflation, rising prices. We got into the Renaissance period here from 1300 to 1500, where things were relatively stable, and then after 1500 up to to the English abolishment of the monarchy in, say, the 1650s, you had a tremendous amount of inflation. Then you had the Enlightenment period up until, say, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and Napoleonic Wars and stuff. And then you had inflation there. And then during the Industrial Revolution, this is kind of an interesting period, because that was the period when liberalism really started getting political voice. But at the same time, political definition and advocacy, by Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and those kind of people. But at the same time, you had stable prices across until the beginning of World War I, but including that time in the Victorian equilibrium, as Fisher calls it, you had a wide expansion of the franchise, more and more people getting the vote. And critically, in the American experience, you had the abolishment of slavery. And slaves now, African Americans, could become property owners and even have a right to be in government, not just a right to vote. Now, that was squelched until the 1950s or 1960s, I should say. So, but there was a real push for Republican governments in this industrial revolutionary period. A lot of countries, of course, came into being: Italy, Germany, so on and so forth. So you could say that Republican zeitgeist was a damper on inflation. And then since then, we've had a very sort of liberal 20th century, and now we're into the 21st century with a lot of inflation. So I'm getting close to the end here. I've got just a few more minutes, but the liberal view says when you're looking at the relationship between government interference, regulation, to zero interference, no regulation, that the liberal idea is that with no, it's just a linear relationship. Efficiency and the public good, public welfare is just always going to be, increasing the more you deregulate the market. But the real view is it's more like an inverted U curve, this blue curve, where yes, it's up to a certain amount. Deregulation frees up the market, and there's efficiency and welfare gains from that. But too little regulation, too much lawlessness, and too much permission to essentially the concentrative tendencies of industries towards monopoly, and the efficiency and welfare starts to decline. Now, there's just couple more points here that the capitalist process depends on the veil of money, and the face behind it is incomplete without it. This was a quote from Joseph Schumpeter. And what is going on behind the veil of money is there's a social order where every agent in the economy, from individual to corporation to government, is being shaped by the accounting framework. People have to manage their budgets according to this kind of accounting system, and I won't get into that, but we will. What happens in this kind of thing is you have this weird oscillation between the value of physical capital and the value of projected capitalization of an enterprise going on. This is one aspect of the sort of distortion that money brings in and leads to bad investment. And another aspect of this is we get this kind of constriction of industrial capacity in the name of maximizing profits. So think of, for example, cartels where they agree on restricting production so that they get the maximum amount of money from let the market determine the maximum amount of money to do that. So it's kind of an intentional sabotage to the technical capacity, but from a business standpoint, that's the way to maximize profit. Well, this same thing, and this is the conclusion, that same pattern comes into play, and this has been discovered in studying of ecosystems, where as things, there's a collection of interacting agents in an ecosystem. It's plants and animals, and they're eating each other, and they get into a developmental sequence that as things become too efficient, this time the efficiency is on the dimensions here are diversity and interconnectivity of the agents. And if you have too much efficiency, it gets to be a very brittle kind of dominant cycle and with a lot of people not on the cycle. Whereas as you get more connectivity or more agents, there's a buffer factor to be able to deal with forces that are coming in, like global warming or absence or forest fires or different kinds of shocks to the system. And that's what I'm promoting as a communitarian political economy, is that you you go to this middle ground, a window of viability, and it ends up where you can have not it shifts from a hierarchical system into an interconnected global group of interconnected small regional economies, and that's the sort of the most resilience and a buffer, along with the best amount of efficiency of the market. And that is the finish of my talk. Okay, are there any questions or comments?
Rick.
Yeah, Rick.
Yeah, just a couple of comments, Torrey. First of all, I really did enjoy this. This was quite fascinating. And one other comment I'd like to make is when you're talking about usury, and you had that quote from Aristotle about measuring being different, whether you're buying or selling. Back in the day, when they were mining coal, the miners used to be paid by the ton. It was a piecework, and they had to mine a long ton to get paid. But when the miners or the mine owners sold the coal, it was all was sold by the short ton.
Oh, really? So a different physical measure.
Yes, exactly. Well, they called it a ton, but there's a long ton and a short ton. Difference between 2,200 pounds and 2,000 pounds.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. That's an interesting point.
And one other point I'd like to make is there's a series of novels written by, I don't know if you ever came across them, by Dorothy Dunnett, called The House of Niccolo.
Niccolo, like Niccolo.
Niccolo. Niccolo.
Uh-huh.
And they're set in the Italian Renaissance, and it involves a guy who's moving up from being a dyer's apprentice to being a running one of these houses, lending money, investing, going to Constantinople and Russia and all the other places, trying to make deals. They're a fascinating series, and it really goes in depth on how they raise my money and how the paper was transferred and debts were bought and sold back and forth.
Wow,
how they tried to bankrupt each other,
right?
Cornering markets and so on.
Obviously, a play on Niccolo Machiavelli. What was the author's name?
Dorothy Dunnett, Dunnet.
Okay, good. I'll look for that. Well, thank you, Rick. That's interesting.
You're welcome.
Shashir?
Thank you, Torrey. That was wonderful. I was not sure where you're going to go with this one, but that was a great historical context that you began with, giving us the reason why you were talking about what you were, and the who's who and how they affected the economies. The paper money, of course, escalated everything. The economies worldwide were put on steroids as soon as credit became available, and the banking system mushroomed out of that. So that's well put. And of course, you define the difference between the present Republicans compared to the Lincoln's Republicans, because they seem to have switched chairs.
Yes.
And the whole idea of gaining some more freedom for people so that they can feel that they are part of a community goes much more toward the socialistic point of view.
Yes.
And we would think that there's going to be more of what we call in Canada liberals, who would try and prepare for better spread of wealth, as opposed to the Republican side or the conservative side, as we call it in Canada, which goes towards freedom to exercise your ability to be entrepreneurial and build your own fortunes, and giving you that ability. Of course, as I've said before many a times, equality and freedom are at odds with each other. Because if you have equality, gives people more or less the same. So we saw that happen in the communist countries, how equality of giving everybody the same piece of bread did not give them any motivation to succeed. And it took away that pride of ownership, pride of wanting to get ahead. Whereas when we look at the freedom side, is of course the conservative side, which says, I would like to be able to exercise my right and succeed and be a somebody. That goes away when we start doing this communal things, which is the individual and the community dependency. That's what I thought you might go with it, but you didn't. You went towards the currency side, which is interesting, because I had not thought about it the way you did. Very, very enlightening. I thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you, Shishir. Thank you.
It's interesting when you talk about the communal system. The First Nations and Inuit always, it was always communal. They owned nothing individually, and it was a participation of everyone, but nothing owned.
Right.
So, and even today, if you go into our northern territories, and I've just discovered this, is that if you want to go to talk to a family in a house, it's rude to knock on the door. You just open the door and walk in, and they treat you to a meal or food. And that's their culture of openness with no ownership.
Yeah.
Very interesting how
Yeah.
the
one of the things, I mean, I think if you remember that upside down U curve,
yes,
that could be kind of what we're trying to go for. Is there's a certain amount of private ownership. It's not. Plato said, in his idea of the republic, there was no private property; everybody owned, and you could even, swap wives and partners and stuff. So that was a little too extreme. Aristotle brought it down to more realistic terms. But I think it's that, getting to that top of that inverted U curve.
exactly.
So, yeah. Anyone else?
John.
Oh, John, yes.
Yeah. My little yellow hand is not really that visible, unfortunately. But anyway, Torrey, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. You mentioned a few times Joseph Schumpeter,
Yes.
and Schumpeter wrote a very famous book called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy.
Oh, yes. I read that.
Yeah, and I think that I understand what Schumpeter at least meant by capitalism, socialism, and democracy. Now, essentially what you have done is introduced a new item on the agenda, communitarianism, which you didn't, I mean, you were talking about Republican theory and the history, and the communitarianism came in kind of at the end.
Right.
Yeah, but it's a different thing than those three things. So I wonder if you could sort of give sort of a nutshell description of how, on the one hand, communitarianism differs from capitalism and socialism. Where does it fit in, on that spectrum? And on the other hand, what is the relationship between communitarianism and democracy?
Okay. One of the nugget of communitarianism is to check the power of monopolies and concentrated industries and markets that are concentrated to a handful of producers. And communitarianism, so it gets down to widespread regional ownership of businesses by locals in those regions, and not the use or not the employment of residents in those regions of multi-regional or multinational corporations. Like you see, Exxon gas stations or chain stores and large corporations that operate worldwide, and in some communities they're the sole employer. So communitarianism is locally owned businesses, local patronage of locally owned businesses, local financing by cooperatives and community banks for local business expansion, and that's the core of the communitarian focus. So it's keeping out multinational corporate are multinational corporations, international globalized enterprises. And so socialism, so it's, and I'm sort of in this talk, I kind of, like I did at the beginning of the talk, I put socialism as an aspect of republicanism. It's a flavor of republicanism. This may not be, well, I don't know. I think Schumpeter might agree with that. That, I mean, I think there's something, I wrote it down. Today there's like 190 sovereign states in the world. 140 of them are technically republics. So, People's Republic of China, the Republic of Congo, and all, there's most of socialist type governments are republics. They try to be. And so some of them are less democratic than others. I would say, the People's Republic of China is not that democratic because there is not that much participation by the masses in policy, which is, the distinction that Aristotle makes for a republic. So democracy is a republican form, is the best. Democracy is most fully realized in a republican form, a true republican form. Socialism is a variant of republicanism. And in capitalism is, I would say, and even say using your terminology, as a theory of enterprise or a method of enterprise, which is private enterprise. So capitalism is limiting large enterprises, basically, to, and it might be through democratic means within an enterprise. So there's a lot of variations or nuances of private ownership now, where you have cooperatives and you have multinational cooperatives or big cooperatives, and you also have like REI or organic what is that, organic farms, dairy cooperatives. They operate. They're very big, but they're very democratically run. So, and you still have independently owned farms or independently owned enterprise units within this larger collection of enterprise. So anyway, the point is, I think you can place communitarianism in all these other sort of categories of polity, collections of people who are self-governing.
Yeah, and of course, polity, according to Aristotle, would be like the pure form, whereas democracy per se would be the degenerate form. I mean, are you arguing that? Yeah.
That's right. That's an important distinction by Aristotle, that polity is where everybody's harmoniously in a democratic way, but democracy is mob rule. It's the tyranny of the mob, the tyranny of the majority.
So you are making that distinction. It's kind of similar to Aristotle in a certain way.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks.
Okay, good. Heather. There you go.
Okay. So you were showing that curve that looks like an inverted U, and the optimal places at the top are kind of in the middle. I'm just wondering if there's any, countries, or maybe smaller than a country, that kind of are in that sweet spot, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I would say think countries like Denmark, Netherlands, smaller countries. I don't know even if Japan would be there, but maybe. What else? That's another issue, is that the scale of a republican state, how big or small the state should be before it might favor the smaller countries, the republican form of government, like Denmark or Netherlands.
Right. It may not be scalable.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was wondering, you were showing that, tendency to go from like different forms of government, like monarchy and aristocracy, and then democracy, and then, often, you try and put guardrails in place, but, I'm a little worried at what's going on in the States right now. Like the guardrails don't enforce themselves. I don't know if there's a solution for that. Like you're kind of depending on people to, have courage when it's really hard sometimes, like there can be personal threats and stuff like that. And
Right.
you just wonder if, it gets to a certain point and, if people don't do what they're supposed to do, it just can all collapse.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any solution for that.
Well, I just, what comes to mind is this analysis that I based my points on by John Pocock. And it's a book called The Machiavellian Moment. And it's those three periods, the Italian humanists, the English, abolishment of the monarchy for a while. He came back, but in a modified form. And then the American Revolution. Those, and maybe right now we're in another Machiavellian moment, and where everybody has to pony up and do their part as best and be brave. And registrars of voters are getting shot at, things like that. And, the Supreme Court has given this one candidate to be above the law and all this kind of stuff. So
yeah, it's a pretty surprising decision. The I just think, someone can call something an official act or whatever and claim they're immune, and this is the guy who's going to do that, right? And
right.
This is when they make that decision. Anyway, I don't have any solutions, but I was hoping there was one.
Yeah. You just have to, we have to, it's a Machiavellian moment. We have to suck it up and be brave. This is my answer.
Yeah, I'm just not sure if it's a moment or, more serious than that.
Well, truly, I mean, yeah, if let's say, for example, just to use the United States, I mean, if Kamala Harris wins, it doesn't mean we can relax. There's been this whole, I would say, corruption.
It's going to be pretty much the same as last time, where there's going to be a huge swath of the population that doesn't accept that result, and many claims that it's not legitimate, and so on and so on.
True.
So, like right now, it seems like, everything's a lot of things that depend on how this vote goes, but if it goes like I hope it does, it's not out of the woods, and like democracy continuing can't depend on getting a good result all the time, especially when things are this divided.
Yeah.
And it's going to be like you almost have to count on flipping heads every time.
Yeah. I can't give you an answer with what's going to happen or all the things that are in play. Just to say, all I can say really is, and like this theorist Pocock, and historian, he's a historian of political philosophy. It was really this when it became evident to people that we could lose our democracy, our Republican democratic government, when it was actually looking like it was curtains, it was lights out. It's it's imminent that it's going to collapse or be taken over by a tyrant. That was when got people not only trying to vote or save it, but that's when it really stimulated a lot of this thinking about it. What's the most important things, so it's a realization that it's not a permanent thing. It's an unstable form of government. It doesn't necessarily last. It requires everybody to really be into it, not take it for granted. And we've gotten in America, USA, and I think it's probably the same for Canada and the UK and a lot of other places, that is one of these other thinkers, Michael Sandel, talks about this procedural republic, which we sort of, well, we just have this legal system. It makes sure everybody gets sort of fair treatment, and things. We have a fair amount of franchise, people can vote, and that'll just take care of everything. And then, but we'll just let the free market, we sort of hands off of the marketplace, and there can be monopolies and sort of all kinds of practices that are, kind of under illicit or like financial wealth creation, which has gotten way deregulated and way crazy. And most of the wealth is now through financial kind of operations. We have this procedural republic. It's not really a full republic where we're all participating. We're making public policy decisions as participating citizens. We just sort of assign it all to either the marketplace or the legal system, and that's a way of losing, a true republican kind of government. So,
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Shashir.
Yeah, just picking up from what you guys are discussing. You mentioned some of the countries and the types of governments. I had a friend who came from Congo, and he described his country as Democratic Republic of Congo.
Right.
And he said it's neither democratic nor is it a republic. You just got to be there at gunpoint.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think it's...
Anyway, coming back to this, Heather's question about how things look pretty dicey when we look south of the border from us. There was a line I read the other day. It said, if you want to live the American dream, you have to live in Denmark.
Yes, right.
Just goes to show that that's where the balance lies.
Exactly.
It's where there is enough distribution of wealth, so the population at large is happy enough, and there's not enough monopolies around that pretty much rules and controls the wealth disparity, which seems to be taking over so many of the Western countries. And this is so unfortunate because this is really shooting yourself in the foot by putting money in your pocket. We've got to learn to live with others. We've got to learn to be able to share. We've got to learn to pay our taxes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the simple things that's happened, a simple correction that can be made is to, reimpose progressive taxation. I mean, part of the liberal conservative moment or conservative movement over the last 40, 50 years in the USA is to reduce that. And that's one of, and it gets to be complicated. I don't want to get into it that much, but when you put a progressive tax on starting at a already pretty high level of income, it doesn't, 60, 70, 80% of the population isn't affected. It's only the super rich that now have to pay more taxes. And it makes a big difference on the total budget, on this quote, socialist redistribution of wealth from the wealthy to the less wealthy. That's always been the big criticism of, taxation, is that it's socialism, it's sort of transferring, redistributing wealth. Well, it doesn't have to happen until sort of these outlier income levels that don't affect most of the population and have gotten high because of these sort of outrageous sort of, IPOs that are, in capital markets that are global. So you have huge swarms of money pouring into, one entrepreneur's pocket. And now he's the richest man in the world as a trillionaire. And and then about the election laws about he's sponsoring a candidate at $45 million a month out of his own pocket. I mean, and then to say that, it's communism if you're trying to, take away those that kind of wealth or something, it's ridiculous, So anyway.
So Torrey, if I can just add one more line.
Yeah.
I do know that one of these big names that and I know, we all know, his manager pays more taxes than he does, and he's one of those trillionaires.
Yeah. 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 Rick.
Yeah, going back to wealth redistribution, if you wait long enough, it does tend to happen. I mean, look at Elon Musk. He spent $44 billion on Twitter, and he's turning that into a hole in the that money that he spent is going to be lost very within the next 5 years. So that, whether it goes in someone else's pocket or just gets disintegrated, I don't know. But if you wait long enough, wealth redistribution tends to happen by itself. Because, like my brother always says, he's a big on statistics. He always says that everything reverts to the mean eventually.
Right, right.
So,
Yeah, well,
a billionaire now, their kids will be working for a living, or their grandkids, they'll be broke. And one way that I can see that happening right now is this massive investment in artificial intelligence. I mean, the more they spend, the less it does, it seems, in fact, actually. But again, I've always been more of a Roger Penrose fan, who said it's impossible, than the guys who are trying to make it now. So that'll redistribute wealth also in a huge way if we wait long enough.
well, the way inheritance taxes go, or inheritance goes, there's still creation of, multi-generational, wealthy families. The top 15, within the top 15 wealthiest Americans, 4 of them are the heir to Sam Walton's fortune of Walmart. Yeah. So we'll see how that goes. Well, thanks, Rick. Ted.
Hi. I'm trying to figure out where I went wrong on communitarianism. I saw this subject come up last week, and I went onto the internet, which is maybe not the best way to try and figure out what something actually is in detail. And it sounded like a very innocent thing at first when I looked it up, but I very quickly got led down a right-wing Jordan Peterson mode with communitarianism as a prefix to the word nationalism.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out where, like, the economic story sounds more perhaps genuine in terms of the historical thing, but maybe I got a naive perspective on it from what it might mean now. And I guess communitarianism as this, it seems to have echoes of what you were describing from the market sensibility, having the various stars around it, but they seem to put it more towards the social aspects of community, rather as in like separating communities, isolating communities, and keeping them apart from one another. And I'm not which came first, and maybe that has to do with what John was talking about with the democracy reference. Is that like the extension of communitarianism as an economic principle, where people took it that step further, or they think they took it a step further to try and mold cultures around it? You know what I mean? The Jordan Peterson rabbit hole was presenting Japan as, because it was a mono society of one cultural group, that it was very stable compared to the melting pot groups of North America and Canada, and the nationalism side of it leading towards the more ludicrous principles of put everybody I don't like over there. Community is my community, and it was less about, or often more about, what's my community, but also who is not my community.
Right.
I'm not sure where I got twisted from there.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a point that is important, that has been, it is in that tension. There's a tension in sort of the philosophy of, political philosophy of communitarianism that includes, the issue of states' rights in America, where, the slave states wanted to just, it's their right to have slaves, and, other states can be free. And it also goes to, the whole German experience of Nazism, where, like you say, they weren't really, well, National Socialism is a kind of communitarianism. So that's the thing. The thing that I would defend communitarianism is, it's like those stars, those interconnected stars. There's a there's a cosmopolitanism that connects all these communal groups. So, and you can't, it sort of ratchets up, the cosmopolitanism ratchets up the human rights and equality principles and rights, and you can't go back to, that's the floor to the whole global system, even though there's these pockets of sort of self-governing, participating regional economies and polities. They're connected to each other. They're not independent of each other, and they're also trading with each other. There's sort of this continual progress in import substitution and local production versus exporting for export trade and things. So it's not total isolation. They're connected, but there's a ceiling or a floor that they can't go back to more less humane types of cultural ideas like racism or
It's like animal husbandry becoming eugenics.
Yeah, right. That kind of, yeah, because you're also scientifically, there's international communities, and in fact, it's not even a regional. It's not necessarily geographic. There's sort of virtual communities. I mean, even like right now, we have a community that's international right here in the API, where Canadian and American and people have logged on onto these calls from the Middle East and Europe and things like that. So it's an international cosmopolitan group and community. So hopefully those interconnections between groups keep the floor in place, and nobody reverts and regresses back into these earlier, more primitive cultural norms.
I guess it goes back to your original chart that you had, where the arcs backwards and forwards from what were the bookends you had on that? Democracy on the right, and not oligopolism. Remember your chart with the humps? Sorry, I can't remember the terms that you had there on the humps.
It's a one, the many, the few. Sorry, the one, the few, the many, and one is sort of can be a good president / monarchy, or it can be a tyrant. The few can be a good aristocracy or a oligarchy, and then the many can be a polity, a genuine polity, or it can be a tyranny of the majority, a democracy, which is a tyranny of the majority. So yeah, it's
that's a disconnect too, because I hear the word tyrant thrown around a lot, and it's like, I think we're in the rule of the many, although there's the oligarchy kind of underneath everything. But I feel like people almost feel like they're a further step back, that they're one step away from totalitarianism and monarchy, when we're actually still way over at the right. And it's like, is that the pull, or is the threat of the extreme always more powerful than the middle?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the way I kind of feel into it is, you either have a balance of the three, or when the democracy or the polity kind of collapses, then the tyranny and the oligarchy kind of work together,
Yeah. I guess I've been reading too much Eric Fromm recently, so.
Oh, Eric Fromm, great.
So yeah.
Ted and Edward, or Ted, what should I call you, Ted?
Ted, I go by Ted. Sorry, I should change my name.
I go by Ted. And Torrey, thanks very much. I just have to break in now at this point, because Alla is, unfortunately had to leave.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things we're trying to do this year is to keep it down, to an hour and a half this year. So it's I don't know, it's around 8:25 or something now. So what I would like to ask is, if we can have one final question, if anyone has a final question, Torrey will respond. And then once that's done, I would like to thank Torrey and wrap up. So is there any final questions?
Well, I'd like to just say thank you very much, everybody, for this. This is a great giving me the opportunity to throw out this sort of big idea I've had for a long time and try to cram it all down into half an hour talk, and then everybody engaged with it. So I really appreciate the comments and the talking and discussion we've had. So thank you all for that.
Yes, we all. For your wisdom. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it, actually. So, Torrey, on behalf of all of us and the API, I would like to thank you very much for yet again. It's not the first presentation you've done. Yet again, another excellent presentation, which, as we see, you all enjoyed, and we hope you come back again.